out or you're in, you lose or you win in these sad old, glad old days. You're poor or you're rich, who knows which is which anyways. We're living on time, we're having to borrow. No one knows if we will live to see tomorrow. Nevertheless, I guess we gotta confess, these are the good old, glad old days.
Good evening, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 446. It's June the 20th, 1980, and it's side one of the tapes.
It's heaven or hell, it's hail or farewell in the good old, bad old days.
I chose Anthony Newley's song from the good old, bad old days because as the Abscam indictments come down, we may get a better view of those good old, bad old days. This tape isn't about Abscam. I started doing tapes on that in February and March. For those of you that don't have them, send for a list of back tapes and get the background before we go into it. Probably next week I'll get into Abscam, continue some of the pieces where I left off before. The indictment of Representative John Murphy was important, and Carlos Marcello this week. Those are two biggies. The Abscam, in essence, will go all the way back to corruption for many years in the United States government. I believe that the arrest of these men may trigger off information about other people that they work with. John Murphy is a graduate of West Point, worked with Mr. Somoza out of Nicaragua, very close to the Shah of Iran, and on the board of directors of the Pahlavi Foundation. These are biggies. Carlos Marcello has been a central character in the Southwest and in California and the East, interconnecting links to high government officials, the highest echelons of organized crime. CIA and Defense Department merged into Carlos Marcello. The question you might ask is, how can they indict people so important? Well, you remember James McCord was caught at Watergate, 20 years with the CIA and the FBI, chief of security for the entire convention for the President of the United States, a member of the 16-man emergency team in Washington, D.C. with the Defense Department. The point is that the country can't control or cover up too many illegal activities of even their highest people, and eventually, when they get caught, they talk. A piece of Scotch tape, an extra piece, caught James McCord, and then after 9 months, he began to bring out the crimes of the President of the United States, and the Attorney General even went to jail, John Mitchell. Save your articles on Abscam. If you haven't got the past ones, get them, and we'll get into them on and off from now on as the indictments roll along. As I say, those are the biggies that they're bringing in. They're arrested for the wrong reasons, but at least they're arrested, and they may, for immunity or easy sentence, begin to tell more about the people they work with. If not, if they're silent, like G. Gordon Liddy, then they're at least silent for a few years and taken off. So either way, they're removed temporarily at least, and it shakes up the other people who are their partners in crime. The FBI had a hotline yesterday in San Francisco. They have a new thing on the air. It's white-collar crime. And I called the FBI offices, 415-552-9948, in case you want to call them. Call your FBI around the country. They're asking for people who could be indicted for white-collar crime, information about these people. I called immediately and talked to an agent, Mr. Lee Evans, and said, now is the time after 17 years for me to express my anger and outrage at white-collar crime, specifically the crime of covering up a criminal investigation of a murder, specifically the President of the United States. And I want you to investigate G. Robert Blakey. He took $6 million from the people of the United States. It was given to him by way of a congressional committee, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I have copies of letters I mailed to him with evidence that they refused to use, incidences of the Oswald doubles in Mexico, of Marina Oswald being an agent of the Defense Department, and of Blakey covering up the conspiracy of who killed the president. That this is a crime, that he was paid to do this job, and under the definition of a crime, if he suppressed this information, he committed a crime. I also have a tape recording of him refusing to tell me if he had the Torbett document, and doing a $6 million investigation without going into the information of the Torbett document or of the role of Leon Marina Oswald in the Soviet Union. So the FBI office is going to call me. I'm to send them a letter. And then the second white-collar crime I want to investigate is Mark Lane. There was a talk about investigating Mark a while back because he takes money as a tax-free write-off for buildings, allegedly. This is what I heard. His Citizens Committee in Washington, D.C., he bought a building and gave lectures on campuses and so forth. And it was a tax deduction for a group that was to investigate the assassinations. And all of this has been going on for many, many years, and he throws lists away. He does not have people investigating. He was not at the House Select Committee on Assassinations of John Kennedy. He walked out at the time of the hearings of Reverend Martin Luther King when he was to represent Grace Stevens, and ran down to Jonestown, and the very woman he was supposed to be representing that day was going to be shipped to Jonestown. Her name was among the correspondents down there in Jonestown, and Mark Lane has not produced a thing, a paper or an item on the Kennedy assassination that has anything to do with the material available that he had access to, and if he's getting a tax deduction for this, and if there's no such foundation, where did the money go? But I think we'd go for G. Robert Blakey because he was under oath of office for a congressional committee, and he was as bad as the Justice Department that covered up the Watergate investigation, the suppression of evidence, and I think that you researchers should assist me and pressure the FBI to investigate Blakey. And if you have information that you sent to him, any of you, all over the country, the Southwest Penn Jones, or Sherman Skulnick, or John Judge, any of you that sent information that he didn't use or refused to use that is valid and can be proved to be part of the conspiracy to kill John Kennedy, we should go for G. Robert Blakey for suppressing this, receiving it and not using it, or refusing to receive it. There's an article in the New York Times, New Public Uses for History, by Peter Stearns and Joel Tarr. They're co-directors of a history social science department at Carnegie Mellon University. And this article goes into the fact that history was relegated the past 40 years to the background of a very narrow audience of people in academic work, and that history has blossomed out, and that independent people, independent researchers are studying history on their own. They're not using the academic field. They're coming to grips in the past 10 years specifically as historians, and they're useful for public use and applied history. And the article tells how if you want to study energy problems and pollution, you can go back to the origin of the pollution in the history, or say the corporations, or when the chemicals started, and that public history can produce answers to some of our needs. Now that is the purpose of all this research that many of us are doing, is to collect this history that will be useful to reconstruct the problems that we have, hopefully to solve some of them while we're living, to pass on to the next generation the answers to how we got into the mess that we're in today. This article tells that they are trying to make usable assessments of how the present and the future are shaped from the past. This is from the New York Times, but doesn't that sound like Mae Brussell? A usable assessment of how the present and future are shaped from the past. And they came to the conclusion the result can revive a key discipline. It can provide a broader range of data and a surer sense of values to the public policy arena. And they talk about a born-again group of historians who are making sure that their own past can serve new needs. A very important article because, in essence, if you say, what is Mae Brussell doing all of this for 8 years, going on 9 years, in May, 9th year of collecting the 17 years of research, the purpose is to apply this. There should be a born-again group of people studying. The first time we went through school was like, say, the born-again Christians born into a church that don't even take their religion and understand what it is. They're dragged by the hand by their parents once a week to sit and listen and go home and have a big meal and get out of your fancy clothes. That's what religion is when you're young. And to really be born again, whether it's Christian or Jew, or to be a born-again historian, is to take the information again and start over the way it is meant to be. Take it and live it. And in this case, history has to be taken out of your 3rd and 4th grade, or your 10th grade, or 12th grade, or your first year of college, and applied, and make it come alive for you. And there's an interesting article about using history and understanding it and applying it to the future by understanding the past. Interesting article. In essence, it's what I'm trying to do. And what you're trying to do, too. Many of you who take these tapes are fantastic at collecting information, data, books, and so forth. And it's really fun to work with all of you and see the gray matter going around as you help me put the pieces together. Speaking of history, there's an interesting book which I've had for a year. I haven't had time to review with you, but you can go ahead and get it and read it, and then we can share information on it. It's called The Russian Fascists, Tragedy and Farce in Exile. And if you can stand the adjectives that this writer uses, he has all these descriptions. Calling these Russian fascists a farce is like calling the Bay of Pigs a fiasco. We make blunders and then we use funny names to cover it up. But this book is about the Russian royalists, the families that left, the Russian emigres that left when the Soviet Union came into power, when the communists were there, and they went all over the world. They emigrated, and they went to Manchuria, specifically where thousands of them were, and formed a fascist organization wearing swastikas and armbands. This is in Manchuria. Many of them came to Connecticut, they came to Pennsylvania, and they had what they called an armed forces there where they trained, and they worked with the Japanese, and they were very active in collaborating with Japanese and the Nazis, and formed a body of very important personages inside the United States and with the royal families in England. And this book has a picture of what they called the 19th hole, and of course that's an important part of Richard Nixon's meetings and the secret meetings, say, of Ronald Reagan. When he meets with Gerald Ford, they meet out on a golf course and have a conversation. When Ted Kennedy met with Jimmy Carter, they met in the White House that could be bugged and recorded. The espionage teams, the really thick espionage teams, have a way of meeting at that 19th hole. That's out in the grass where nobody can record you or follow you. And there's a picture of the 19th hole of the meeting place of these particular people. And there also was an important meeting in 1933 of the Royalists and the emigres. There's a photograph of them meeting, a tri-party conference of rightist emigres in Berlin in 1933. This may have been as important as the Appalachian meeting of organized crime in 1957 in upstate New York. And many people in the world were not conscious of the fact of the czars and the Nazis and the power that they had in the United States and with the news media, with their swastikas and armbands, and they were sold in Pennsylvania. This is a very interesting book, and again, it goes back to the origins of World War II and getting us on the brink of World War III with Mr. Brzezinski. And you get the book and read it. It's just filled with all kinds of information, and I'll get to it later. I did want to bring and update certain matters and investigations that are going on, certain deaths, political assassinations, and so forth that have taken place, that I have to update some of the material with you at this time. I just can't miss one article. It was in the Associated Press this past week. $1 million a minute is spent on arms. I don't know if it's very easy to grasp that, but maybe we should just take one moment to think about what we're saying. The arms race costs the world $1 million every single minute. Humanity possesses the means to destroy all life and organized life on our planet. At the same time, it can't feed and clothe the world's poor. There is no housing, there's no health plans, it's intolerable. This is a figure. $480 billion was spent in 1979. So if you take it and translate it, this past year, $1 million a minute that was spent for weapons. I don't even know if this figure includes your private rifles, your stockpiles of brigades, your Hare Krishnas, your Jim Jones type of church-related Synanon arms, private citizens, rifle clubs, Minutemen, Nazis, your handguns. I'm not even sure if this figure covers private weapons or if this is just the budget of buying the big weapons, $1 million a minute. It may be $2 million a minute privately, arms that are shipped around. Speaking of history, there was a long article in the New York Times this last week Greeks look at history and blame their woes on the United States. And it's an article about the political party called the PASOK, P-A-S-O-K, and Andreas Papandreou, the leader of PASOK. And he tells about the historical experience of Greece the last 15 years, how Turkey did not favor the United States in World War II. It fought against the Allies. It was neutral during World War II, and Turkey is favored by the United States government now. And he says, why should the Greeks have anything to do with the United States? That they were our allies in the war. They sent troops to Korea. They joined NATO. They had Americans on their bases, and they're considering severing with the United States, leaving NATO completely, closing American bases in Greece. And what they've been trying to teach the people in Greece, in essence, is the history of their government. Papandreou came back to office in 1974 when the military dictatorship was kicked out, and they're trying to teach them the history of their country. There's a quotation in the New York Times giving a history lesson to the electorate in Greece is different than in the United States. It says that's a sure way to lose votes in the United States, but in Greece it works. For the Greeks, history is their key to identity and their pride. And they go on to say in the article that an 8-year-old knows that in 1964 and in 1968 the Americans stopped Turkey from invading Cyprus, but in 1974 they didn't do a thing. They stayed out of it. The government there, Papandreou and so forth, are turning anti-American. They feel that there's no advantage to being our ally, that we betray the countries that we worked with. And the reason we're making them suffer is that when we kicked out the military junta and ended fascism and the resurgence of Nazism in Greece, when we kicked them out, then the United States turns its back on Greece. This is what we did in Chile. When Allende was in the World Bank, stopped investing money in Chile, we stopped trading with them, we bankrupted them, we caused economic depression and riots so that Allende would be killed and we could get Pinochet in power. The United States turns its back on Greece. If it isn't a military dictatorship, if they can't control a fascist state, then we ignore it completely and go with people that didn't support us during World War II that could be fascists. One of the prides of my life, one of the things that pleases me so much is the letter I got from Andreas Papandreou. Many of you who know my past work or have read my articles have seen a copy of that letter. In the summer of '72, I wrote the article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And that was the whole umbrella history of our era, of Nixon and the Nazis and the fascist control that the United States has over all of these countries, and how the Watergate arrest would lead eventually to the opening up of the true history of the United States and what we've done. And in December, that was just 5 months after my article was published, I got a letter from Andreas Papandreou, who's now the leader of the PASOK, the political party in Greece. He went back to Greece when the junta was overthrown. He wrote to me, he was in exile in Ontario, Canada, and he wrote me a letter, Dear Mae Brussell, I'm overwhelmed by the amount of work you've done and the documentation you bring to support your thesis. I have tried myself for a long time to bring out the conspiratorial aspects of the Greek coup of 1967, read the American coup, and just now, 5 years later, does it seem that people are beginning to understand how that happened and how Greece went under a dictatorship. Then he wrote, Your work is tremendously important. You have understood the framework with which these events take place. But more than that, you have dug out the facts. And then he sent me material for a newsletter. I should really contact him in Greece and send him a copy of the tapes and update him, because Paul Krasner never got out the newsletter after my 3 articles were published. He had sent a check for them. But that was 1972. He'd be surprised how much more I've done in 8 years to get out these facts. And I understand completely not only what he's saying about America betraying him in Greece at this time, I understand why they're doing it, and I understand completely his wanting to pull out of NATO and taking the Americans off the bases, because he'll get nothing from them, and what he'll get is an infiltration until he's killed and another fascist dictatorship is put into power in Greece. Penn Jones in Midlothian, Texas, has a newsletter, The Continuing Inquiry, that many of you take. The last issue just came out May 22nd, and he has a note on it about the famous Umbrella Man in the Kennedy assassination. He has a picture of the Umbrella Man sitting by the curb. And in the newsletter, he said, many of you are familiar with the attempts to identify this man by researcher Robert Cutler of Massachusetts. Cutler's theory of the umbrella as a flechette poison dart launcher deserves serious consideration, although Penn Jones believes that the umbrella man was a signal for the guns to go off the fatal headshot that killed John Kennedy in November 1963. The continuing inquiry says in 1979, Cutler named his chief suspect on radio, TV, and in print as a well-known former CIA man long associated with the case. Now Cutler is being threatened with a libel suit by this man. We print the following letter from Cutler, and in the newspaper he has a letter from Bob Cutler. I just want to say in passing that Bob Cutler came out with what I call a cockamania story of who the man was who fired the shot from the umbrella. I didn't believe the story. He was supposed to be on a radio station in San Francisco with this story, breaking it on the air in San Francisco, and the commentator asked me for my opinion, and I said at the time, you can do what you want, but I don't take a bit of grain of truth in this story. I don't go for it. It's similar to A.J. Weberman being sued by E. Howard Hunt for saying that he was at Dealey Plaza the day that John Kennedy was assassinated. So far, I've been pretty lucky in terms of lawsuits, and I'm also pretty careful with my research. I don't believe the man he named was that person. I don't think this man helps the cause. There are many people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Mary Farrell works with Gordon Novell. He worked with Charles Colson, with Richard Nixon, with the Central Intelligence Agency. He's not going to help the researchers, and any information he has will not help researchers. Rush Harp was gung-ho about Gordon Novell being involved in Dallas and so forth. I never took that line, and I think they're going into a trap. They're getting into a trap that doesn't actually fit together. I'm sorry Cutler is going to be sued by this party, but he took a position that just doesn't make sense. And when you go off on a limb like that, it can be pretty dangerous, and they can have some messy lawsuits. Just this last week in the Los Angeles Times was an article which is very important that ties together the Robert Kennedy assassination, the Los Angeles Police Department, and abscam at the same time. I didn't see it in any of my wire services around the country, so I want to share it with you now. The lead story is by Ronald Ostrow, titled Charges That Stephen Reinhardt Had Mob Ties is Holding Up His Judgeship. Now, I suggest you write to the Senate Judiciary Committee about this character. I'll give you his name in the printed sheet. This story comes out of Washington. A Republican staff member of the Senate Judiciary Committee said that they're holding up the appointment for a federal appellate court judgeship to Mr. Reinhardt. His name is Stephen Reinhardt. He's from the Los Angeles Police Commission. He's the president of the Los Angeles Police Commission, and he's up to be a federal judge. And a witness who is important to the Carlos Marcello indictment that was just made this week, Joseph Hauser, who's a convicted briber turned informant, has made links of Stephen Reinhardt to organized crime. Now, what you have here is a witness, Joseph Hauser, talking about Carlos Marcello and the mob, and also talking about the president of the Los Angeles Police Commission. This is a man that has kept Ed Davis on the police force, who's running for the Senate, and Daryl Gates, and the California politicians that have been involved in the assassination murder syndrome in the whole Southwest are behind the appointment of this judge. So as the abscam arrests take place, it was very cute to try to get federal judges appointed that maybe these cases would go before. This article tells about Joseph Hauser, the briber, who is important in the central government investigation of organized crime in Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. That would be mobsters with the assassination teams, and he's involved with insurance kickback indictments. The first indictments were made this last week against Billy Wayne Clayton, Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, and 3 others for fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Mr. Hauser has been working with the FBI. He's closely associated in Beverly Hills and Texas with these insurance agencies. He served 30-month prison term for masterminding a bribery kickback scheme. He's now in a federal prison in La Tuna, Texas, and he's receiving special protection because he's one of the main witnesses against Carlos Marcello, the organized crime boss from New Orleans. Now, most of you, but not all of you, are familiar with the fact that Carlos Marcello wanted to get rid of Robert Kennedy, who was in the Senate, who became the Attorney General when his brother was President of the United States, who was going after crime and racketeering and the organized crime. And Robert Kennedy had deported Marcello, who's out of the country. Marcello got back into this country and was after Robert Kennedy with a New Orleans base, and has been linked even by G. Robert Blakey, who I mentioned earlier in the tapes, with Santos Traficanta, to the possibility of being key figures in the murder of John Kennedy. And, of course, the House Select Committee didn't investigate Robert Kennedy's murder, but their real antagonism not only was to John Kennedy, but also to Robert Kennedy. So Carlos Marcello is being indicted, and a major witness against him that brought the indictment down is saying, wait a minute, the United States judiciary wants to appoint a federal judge to the appellate court who's president of the Los Angeles Police Commission, and that's the group that covered up the murder of Robert Kennedy's assassination. So you can keep this name and the sheet enclosed and follow it later. Now, the interesting thing about the allegations that Mr. Hauser made, that Mr. Reinhardt from the Los Angeles Police Department is linked to organized crime and the mob and Carlos Marcello, is that his attorney is in New York City, and it's Henry Rothblatt of New York, who is a Central Intelligence Agency attorney for E. Howard Hunt or Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorini, involved in the Kennedy assassination and the Watergate defendants. So, as I said earlier, and I have to stress this over and over to get the groundwork clear, the abscam will bring in not only the current payoffs, briberies, and kickbacks, but it goes back to the same team and workers of the Kennedy assassinations, take it back to Dallas, if no further. So Henry Rothblatt is the attorney for Stephen Reinhardt, the president of the Los Angeles Police Commission, who wants to be a federal judge, and he also is the attorney for the Watergate defendants that go back to the Dallas assassination. The details of these allegations, as I said before, are not released by Henry Rothblatt, who, interestingly enough, is the attorney for this man on the police commission. Now, who supported Mr. Reinhardt before the judiciary to become a federal judge, and you might write to the Senate Judiciary and send letters to the committee, because it's now under study. Orrin Hatch, the most conservative member of Congress, wanted to hold up this appointment. He held it up because he knew that the Los Angeles police report raised questions of Mr. Reinhardt being associated with organized crime figures, but there was strong endorsement by who? Chief of Police Daryl Gates from Los Angeles, who was under Ed Davis when Robert Kennedy and many, many others, the goon squads, are out killing like in Brazil, the hit squads in Los Angeles. Daryl Gates is pushing federal Judge Reinhardt. Also Sheriff Peter Pitchess of Los Angeles. He's the mastermind behind the Manson murders, the Sharon Tate LaBianca affairs, the Isla Vista, again, working with L. Patrick Gray and the whole gang in the Federal Justice Department covering up. California is a nest of murders and conspiracies. I'm sure many exist in other states, but I'm most familiar with these characters, having lived in Los Angeles and knowing the whole network of these people up and down the state with their interlocking links to the mind control programs and prison experimentations here. Another person pushing for the appointment of Stephen Reinhardt on the federal court, coming from the Los Angeles Police Commission, is Evelyn Younger, former Attorney General of the state. Evelyn Younger, who is a district attorney who prosecuted Sirhan for shooting Robert Kennedy when Thane Caesar, the man who had the second gun, who let off those bullets standing behind Robert Kennedy, is now, I understand, working at La Costa for Modalis of organized crime. So you have Evelyn Younger, Peter Pitchess, Dale Gates, the entire assassination cover-up team, rooting in the federal judiciary, the Senate judiciary, to push L.A. Police Commissioner President Stephen Reinhardt at a time where the primary witness against Carlos Marcello is a Mr. Hauser, who says that this soon-to-be federal judge is linked to organized crime, not only to the mobsters, the Central Intelligence Agency, to Mr. Rothblatt, to the whole can of worms. These teams stick pretty close together, and if the crack open one piece of the shell, it'll begin to become unglued. These are the parts that Watergate didn't go into, the links of the Watergate defense to the assassinations. But watch this appointment and write to the Senate Judiciary and send in a letter or a copy of this tape and tell them what you think about the appointment of Mr. Reinhardt and the people who are sponsoring it, and how important it is to open up the Robert Kennedy assassination. You see, the House Select Committee didn't go into that, and yet Ed Davis, the chief of police of L.A., is running for the Senate of California, and all the major people involved in that are moving up politically and will be an important part of Ronald Reagan's federal cabinet if we don't move and open these stories now. On the other side of the tape, I have some other interesting news items of current deaths and scandals to keep you updated. It is very important news that a man who's a candidate for a federal appellate court judgeship be exposed at the present time for not only being linked to organized crime in the Carlos Marcello gang, but he's president of the Los Angeles Police Department Commission. I have in front of me a pile of current articles, not the history of the Los Angeles Police Department, but just articles from the past few weeks. I mentioned last week on the tape about Dwayne Wolfer being removed from office temporarily from the Los Angeles Police Department. There's another article in the LA Times this past week about Dwayne Wolfer, head of the Scientific Investigative Division, suspended by Police Chief Daryl Gates. That's the man who's supporting the new federal judge, the nomination of the federal judge. Gates fired him for 30 days without pay while he investigated the improper storage and analysis of bullets, of other evidence, of improperly supervising the firearms and explosive investigations. He's been charged with sloppy handling of evidence, of lethal chemicals in the office, of drinking on duty, of firing pellet guns in their office, and there was testimony this week that they would shoot at winos out on the street and wake them up and hurt them with these pellets and then laugh hysterically at people drunk in the police offices and shooting at people outside on the streets. Dwayne Wolfer has been mentioned here. In 1975, the State Court of Appeal concluded that he gave false testimony bordering on perjury of a murder trial of a former Deputy District Attorney, Jack Kershke, and that also was linked to the later 1968 murder of John Kennedy, the same character, Dwayne Wolfer. In 1974, he was reprimanded for improper conduct in handling a civil service examination for the police department, and he was disqualified from serving on civil service interview boards. Later, he was reprimanded along with his other gang and a man named Richard Bingle for having lethal chemicals stored in the police laboratory illegally in 1978. As I say, the group that have been suspended right now have been drinking, firing pellet guns, and they have been falsely, and this is a quotation, falsely answering internal affairs investigative questions. Well, to simply lie about one questionnaire would be to cover up maybe the murder of a major person, or even just a civil rights person, or a teacher, professor, or somebody exposing criminal investigations. They've been charged with falsely answering investigative questions. Another article from the LA Times recently, officer shoots at patrol car and injures another officer. They're so gun happy. It's similar to the Salt Lake City shooting where one officer was injured and later allegedly commit suicide, killed by another man on the police force. One article in the LA Times this last week, Los Angeles Citizen Police Review Board sought to check in the crimes of the Los Angeles Police Department. Another one, Mayor Bradley asked tighter police spying curbs. Rights of citizens may have been violated. This is June the 5th, 1980, by the Los Angeles Police Department, and Mayor Tom Bradley is catching on that they constantly have violated the rights of people in Los Angeles. Another trial going on in Los Angeles Police Department, a man who's sitting in a wheelchair who's been paralyzed. Victim recounts shooting attack. Los Angeles police officers face trial. They paralyzed him from the waist down. They mistook him for an armed robber. He wasn't a criminal of any kind. Another article, Los Angeles Police Department, City Hall clout waning under pressures. There is a lot of pressure to go into Chief of Police Daryl Gates and Ed Davis and the entire goon squad, which, as I say, if it isn't investigated, will become your national problem. It's our local California problem now. If Reagan's in, it becomes your problem. You can't afford to look it over. Another article, ruling sought on open police hearings. Another one, off-duty officer kills a bicyclist in Long Beach, California. A man died from a bullet wound in the stomach. He was confused with another suspect and gunned down and killed. A scandal of Peter Pitchess, Sheriff Peter Pitchess, and the Board of Supervisors on the political implications and investigations of the Los Angeles Police Department, and this goes very high up into the politics of this nation, and the crimes are being committed out here on the West Coast. Peter Pitchess is one of the people who has been very much involved with various crimes, along with Ed Davis. They're very political people and involved in scandals in that area, and of course they're the men supporting this judgeship at this time. Another article, Los Angeles police spied on peaceful groups, 45 pages of secret intelligence reports just opened up. There were more a few years ago coming out. Another article, 2 policemen shot winos, and it tells how they were laughing. As I said before, Dwayne Wolfer and the others thought it was very funny to shoot pellets at people on the street, get drunk from the police department offices, and shoot out the windows. Another article, the district attorney won't charge officer in shooting, but criticizes LAPD's handling of the case. The District Attorney John Vandekamp in Los Angeles will not prosecute Los Angeles police officer who shot an unarmed man while he was off duty. The officer was drunk at the time of duty. They went out of a West Side jazz club. He severely wounded a man, shot him, and is not punished. And they said, well, he didn't die, and we're not going to punish the policeman. Another article, major police official defies council panel and refuses to reveal the intelligence division spending. They call it the Public Disorder Intelligence Division, but that was the notorious criminal conspiracy section that was behind setting up so many prison riots and murders in California, and they refuse to reveal the extent of what they're doing. Another article in the Los Angeles Times, placating the people. Many countries accept spying as normal by the police. That Los Angeles debate would never be heard abroad because police intelligence is common overseas, of course in many dictatorships overseas. Jim Jones was let off the hook because of his lewdness and his sexual perversions by the Los Angeles Police Department with the collusion of the officials, the highest officials in state government. I did a tape way back on that, the dismissal of the case, a letter from Chief of Police Ed Davis's aide telling Jim Jones he's the greatest guy, and then up out of Daryl Gates' office, he's now chief of police in Los Angeles. When the arrests were made on Jim Jones, Stanford lawyer Tim Stone stepped in, Dale Speck, assistant police chief in Sacramento, and he became director of law enforcement in the state attorneys general under Dumikian right now, Mike Franchetti, who's chief assistant to the state attorneys general, and then they contacted Evel Younger. When he was the attorney general, a judge, Clarence Stromwell, ordered Jim Jones' records sealed and destroyed, and the district attorney Bert Pines down there was involved. If all of this had come out, those 900 or more deaths, and there were more at Jonestown, would never have happened. But the police investigated last week the documents on the dismissal of Jim Jones' case, and according to Los Angeles Times, many of the documents were destroyed, so they can't come to any conclusions now. According to this latest article, 35 exhibits of Judge Clarence Stromwell's dismissal were ordered sealed and destroyed. The records of the case were sealed and destroyed, and then they admitted, this is in June of 1980, that if they had conducted an investigation, it might have changed history. If they hadn't altered the court documents on Jim Jones, it might have changed the entire history of those people's lives. The LA Times article went on to say that there were intriguing references to the city attorney's reports on the handling of handwritten notes on Jim Jones' arrest, and allegedly they were found in the case of Leo Ryan. When he went down to Guyana and was killed, he had information about the suppression of the arrest of Jim Jones by the Los Angeles Police Department. And Jacqueline Spear, the aide to Leo Ryan, had doubt that Ryan had questioned Jim Jones about the arrest, but a member of the House of Representatives who was gunned down in Jonestown got tangled in the web of the federal government, organized crime, gun running, narcotics, pornography, perversions, and the welfare system, the whole ball of wax, the mind control, nurtured with the Los Angeles Police Department, Sheriff Peter Pitchess, and the California authorities. And Leo Ryan had information on the suppression. And when they opened up these cases last week and began to probe the arrest of Jim Jones, and I did tapes for you on that a while back, they found it disappointing that this Judge Clarence Stromwell had ordered this sealed and destroyed. It'd be interesting to go in the background of Judge Stromwell, because I'm sure that if this other federal judge is appointed or was appointed on the case and wasn't publicly exposed, thanks to one agent who's now breaking the Abscam story with Carlos Marcello, if he wasn't exposed, those are the kind of judges you have sitting on these cases who lock, seal, destroy efforts of the major criminals, white-collar criminals they are, of the worst sort, who are involved in mass murders, mass experimentation, murdering of senators, politicians, members of the House of Representatives, mass murder of hippies, musicians. The California violent syndrome is surfacing now, so it's very important to go back to the past tapes I've done, the articles I've written, and save these articles and follow them. Another important link to these murder syndromes in the Southwest came out last week in an article, again, the Los Angeles Times. You're not getting it syndicated, and if you read the front article, you wouldn't get much of it, so it's for me to interpret, for you to write, again, our history of the Times. The article, lead article in big black letters, is Van Nuys suspect extradited from Argentina faces a murder plot charge. Now, this came in the Los Angeles Times May 22nd, 1980, written by Bill Farr. He's sort of the crime editor of the Los Angeles Times. And I might mention that Mr. Murphy of the Los Angeles Times, that took over the directorship from the Chandlers, Otis Chandlers, and combined with the Dallas Times Herald, Murphy is a liaison of the Central Intelligence Agency to the Los Angeles Times. He is the CIA. He used to be president of UCLA, of the university, before he went to work for the LA Times. And at that time, I wrote to Mr. Murphy and challenged his having Wesley Liebler in the law department. He was one of the attorneys for the Warren Commission who covered up the links of the Nazis and the White Russian czars to the Defense Intelligence Agency, to Lee and Marina Oswald. Arlene Specter from Philadelphia covered up the single bullet theory. Liebler covered up the deepest echelons of the Allen Dulles, Rockefeller, Intrepid, Galen agents. And then he went on to teach law at UCLA, and I wrote to Murphy at that time. And of course, right after he was president of the university, he went on to bigger things. If he couldn't influence the minds of the state students being educated at the University of California, he had much more control, taking over a big hunk of the Los Angeles Times, where you're reaching over 3 million people every day. Well, Bill Farr writes for the Los Angeles Times, and this didn't go over the Associated Press or the United Press. But getting into that article, those of you who have my early tapes going back, and many of you do, and those of you who don't can get it, October 23rd, 1977, that was 2.5 years ago, I did a tape, number 292, and we're up to 446, on the near murder of Jack Eggars, the Howard Hughes control agent. Very important name, Jack Eggars. He was almost murdered. Well, the man being brought back from Argentina, being tried 2 years later, is the man who was going to murder Jack Eggars. I'll give you the story as it is in the New York Times, but for background, in case you don't remember Jack Eggars, he was the assistant chief of police in Beverly Hills, California, and he ran the police department, and he was the man in charge of the bungalow where Howard Hughes was taken in 1957. Howard Hughes was seen visibly from 1957 until 1966, when he was taken on a train by the Central Intelligence Agency, and if you believe the book Forces of Power by William Taub, John Rosselli of Organized Crime went along with the CIA and took Howard Hughes and delivered him to a place in Boston, and he was put in a hospital. And then Howard Hughes was never seen physically as a human being again. If he existed, it was in terms of documents of corporations running the Hughes empire, combining the Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the FBI, and organized crime. And by going into Vegas and taking 6 casinos, buying them with Hughes money, They controlled the skimming money and the mafia, and had a television actually in a room that could take within 6 or 10 feet of every single inch of Las Vegas, Nevada. If you see the Ian Fleming story, Diamonds Are Forever, it's the story of Howard Hughes in Vegas. Well, Jack Eggars took Hughes. Hughes was kept in viewing rooms, and he was given Perrier water and chocolate bars until he got so constipated he was sitting on the toilet all day, and he was literally starved and also given drugs. At the time that he was doped and injected, Eddie Fisher had the same building or office, and he was being doped for other reasons. I'm not quite sure yet, or I have never put enough energy into why Eddie Fisher was a victim, but he was upstairs and Howard was down, and they put Howard, who is a mathematical genius, an inventor, a whiz at mechanics and so forth. They used the Hughes empire and took over the Summa Corporation, the Mormon Mafia, made it really a appendage of the United States government. There was no Hughes. There was only a place to build satellite stations, think tanks, war machines, and weapons systems for the entire world. Bobby Hall, who had interconnecting links with all of the politicians in Los Angeles, was murdered. And if this story ever breaks, and it should break, this is the chain of command that would bring down Ronald Reagan out of his political office after building up all these years. And the reason so many of these people had to be killed and interwoven in a network of murder was in order to make sure that Reagan did get the nomination. He's getting pretty old, and the selected persons for the White House were Nixon, Agnew, and then Reagan. And if the Bobby Hall story ever came out of the Jack Eggars or the Howard Hughes story, it would bring Reagan down. See, Reagan's campaign is managed by Senator Paul Lasault from Nevada, and Howard Hughes' empire, the multinational defense industry security command, selected Paul Lasault as their president. But rather than use him, they have Ronald Reagan as the front man. He's the puppet, he and Nancy, and Lasault and that other gang that controlled Howard Hughes run Reagan and have the stick with the strings that attaches to them. So the Eggars story, the Jack Eggars story, is very, very important to the Hughes, Paul Lasault, Reagan political connections. Well, Jack Eggars was instrumental in receiving information. He got a phone call right away that a man named Bobby Hall was murdered, and I did tapes and radio shows on that a while back. And the men who killed Bobby Hall, the supplier of the drugs that kept Hughes under control, and other politicians and actors in Hollywood and well-known people throughout the state, particularly the Southwest, Bobby Hall had to be murdered. He was killed. And a man named Ginsburg is serving a life sentence for the murder of Bobby Hall. And another man, LaBelle, was convicted, and his conviction was overturned by the State Court of Appeals. So only one person is serving a sentence, Mr. Ginsburg, for killing Bobby Hall. But the minute they killed him, they called Jack Eggars on the phone and said, "We got rid of Hall," because Hall was one of these very important middlemen. He was similar to, say, William Harvey or Sheffield Edwards or George de Mohrenschildt. He was one of these big connecting links to blackmail, extortion, and the Howard Hughes story. And after Hughes was dead, Hall had to be killed immediately because Eggars was the control. Well, with Eggars knowing so much, a man was sent to kill Eggars, and I did as a tape, as I say, in 1977, the near murder of Jack Eggars. 2.5 years passed, and this week, this is the story from the Los Angeles Times. A former Van Nuys motorcycle shop owner fled to South America in 1979 because he was due to appear in a Los Angeles Superior Court to face the charge that he plotted to kill Jack Eggars. Anthony Ragusky, who's 39 years old, has been in Buenos Aires until last month, and after 5 months of extradition proceedings, they want to prosecute him for the attempted murder of Jack Eggars. Jenkins said the Los Angeles Police Department detectives are investigating a possible link between the alleged plot to kill Eggars and Eggars' role as a key prosecution witness against the two men charged with murdering Robert Duke Hall. In addition to the charge of conspiracy to murder Jack Eggars, Ragusky was also wanted in the shooting of a Culver City man. The slaying was drug-related. You see, in this case, the drugs were going not just on the streets, Hollywood Boulevard or Sunset. They were going to very high politicians whose careers would be ended if you knew who they were supplying the drugs for. This man is waiting trial for one other murder charge, and he was working with a man, David Jolson, who was told to, the two of them were told to shoot Eggars in the head. In 1979, he skipped out of the country. There was $25,000 bail, and he went down to Argentina, to Buenos Aires. And that's an interesting place because Argentine borders on Chile, where the Colonial Dignidad is, and the whole team of assassination experts, the gunmen that come out of there might easily retreat back there for protection. And why they're extraditing him now for trial, it's pretty iffy because they all may begin to talk. I don't know why. This gentleman was arrested in front of Eggars' house. He rang the doorbell and asked for directions, and Eggars got suspicious and took the license number and thought maybe there would be a hit for him. Can't imagine why he would be suspicious. By 1977, all the major witnesses to the House Select Committee and Watergate were being offed in the John Kennedy assassination, so Eggars was a little suspicious and traced $5,000 cash that was paid out to kill him. There was $5,000 on the line. This article goes on. Eggars was the chief witness against Jack Ginsburg and former professional wrestler Gene LaBelle in the Hall case. Hall was killed July 22, 1976. You see, Don Bowles, the reporter from Arizona who had been investigating organized crime and white-collar crime in Arizona, was beginning to write articles about organizations that would link to the youth organization, the swindling of money combined with organized crime. And then he was murdered, and that murder was hushed up. There's been controversy between the defendants. They're in and out of jail like yo-yos also. That was linked to the Howard Hughes story. But this Los Angeles Times does mention that Eggars was the key witness against Jack Ginsburg and Gene LaBelle, and that Hall was murdered July 22, 1976. And as I said, Ginsburg is serving a life sentence. The LA Times goes on, at the time Eggars was acting as an agent for the Burbank Police Department. See, as soon as Bobby Hall was murdered, the men who murdered him called. They called before and said they were going to do the job. They called afterwards and said, we did it. Then Eggars skipped out of the Beverly Hills Police Department so it wouldn't be linked or contaminated to this situation, went off to the Burbank Police Department, which is not as well known as the LA Times says. He earlier had been forced to resign from the Beverly Hills Police Department because of his involvement in the murder case. Imagine one of the chiefs of police of the Beverly Hills Police Department who is involved with foreknowledge beforehand and afterwards of the murder of a primary witness who worked with him in holding somebody like Hughes captive in a bungalow. The LA Times article says Eggars delayed going to the Burbank Police Department for 46 days. He didn't tell them that he received a phone call from Ginsburg before Bobby Hall's murder in which he said he was going to kill the private detective, and he maintained he didn't report it later on threats that his son might be killed. At the time of Watergate, when the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy weren't discovered for a while, and they had disappeared. E. Howard Hunt had gone to Beverly Hills and stayed at an attorney's home in Beverly Hills when the story was breaking, and E. Howard Hunt was in the employ of the Howard Hughes organization at the time, as was G. Gordon Liddy. One day I'll do a tape for you on the letters of William Colby to Howard Baker, Senator Howard Baker, that the entire Watergate operation was, every one of those defendants was working for the Hughes organization. A clincher to this article, just to finish the article in the Beverly Hills Police Department about Jack Eggars from the Los Angeles Times, it said, more recently, Eggars was the center of controversy stemming from his appointment by Governor Jerry Brown on the recommendation of Lieutenant Mike Curb, that's our Lieutenant Governor at the present time, to be head of the California Crime Resistance Task Force. Jack Eggars was recommended for that. It's an unsalaried advisory group designed to encourage citizen involvement in crime prevention programs. As I said before, when E. Howard Hunt came to California, he went right to Beverly Hills, and it was a Beverly Hills Police Department that had arrested Elmer Davis for being in Dr. Fielding's office, Dr. Lewis Fielding, the psychiatrist's office, at the time of the Watergate investigations. This all came out, going to Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist. The Beverly Hills Police Department worked with the CIA. Louis Tackwood said they did. They worked with the Criminal Conspiracy Section of Los Angeles Police Department. They worked with the Hughes organization. They worked with the Defense Department and drugged and kidnapped Howard Hughes as a cloak for all this espionage operations. And Jack Eggers was recommended by Governor Jerry Brown. Well, why would Jerry Brown take Mike Kerb's suggestion? And I've told you on many tapes, watch Lieutenant Governor Mike Kerb, and you'll have plenty of chance to see him in Detroit this summer as Master of Ceremonies of the Republican Convention. And this is what I say, people are moving up. Why, in political power and strength, Mike Kerb, a protege of Ronald Reagan's, Jack Eggers would have an important position, as would Evel Younger, Peter Pitches, Charles Bates, the entire network of the COINTEL Police Department, FBI, CIA, Interpol, connecting links. Mike Kerb wanted Jack Eggers to be on a resistance task force in crime prevention programs when they covered up the burglary of Lewis Fielding's office and nabbed a poor black man who was in Beverly Hills at the time and sent him to jail for several years, and he didn't even know where the offices were for Dr. Lewis Fielding. And then E. Howard Hunt was quick in Beverly Hills with the Hughes organization and the Summa Group flying out to California at an attorney's place, Jack Eggers in the police department of Beverly Hills. The article goes on to say it was Eggers' delay in reporting his knowledge of the Hall case that triggered the criticism of his appointment to the commission. I might say that the governor of our state, Governor Jerry Brown, has a father, Pat Brown, who used to be the governor of the state of California. And Pat Brown has a law office in Beverly Hills. And one of the lawyers in his office is Mr. Joseph Ball, who was a lawyer for John Ehrlichman in the case of the burglary of the Lewis Fielding office and the White House plumbers. And Louis Ball was a member of the Warren Commission that covered up the murder of John Kennedy and the assassination, also done with people from organized crime linked to the Hughes organization. This is a ball of wax. A lot of it centers the power for the next Republican convention, for when Richard Nixon was in power, the J. Walter Thompson agencies that handled PR for Argentine, for the Los Angeles Police Department, for the San Francisco Police Department, the mind control centers when Candy Jones was getting her double personality for the Central Intelligence Agency, she came to Oakland. So these California pieces of information I'm giving to you become national problems when Candy Jones goes to visit Jimmy Hoffa or she's told to commit suicide in the Bahamas. Her training for her mind control is in California. So the names that you see in this article, this Jack Eggers that worked with the Howard Hughes group, or Bobby Hall, who was murdered, or the entire Mike Kerb syndrome, or Peter Pitches and Ed Davis, Evel Younger, Daryl Gates, the police commissioners, they're all part of a network of a Gestapo that can surface in every court case or trial or expose that brings them down, simply cools off. It doesn't stop permanently. It's like throwing a bucket of water on Mount St. Helena, but at least cool it off as much as you can and try to understand the network of these names. Dwayne Wolford, this important man who brings disgrace to the police department, has had many important jobs in the Los Angeles Police Department, suppressing information, rearranging evidence, rearranging vital physical evidence, perjury at trials, and he keeps getting promotions. He's still in charge of different offices. Right now he isn't fired permanently. It's a 60-day layoff without pay, and he'll be back again. The network of the people in California is terribly important, and as Abscam breaks, as Carlos Marcello is indicted with his hatred of Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy killed in Los Angeles, covered up by these police people, and federal judgeships coming up, a man that worked as the president of the police commission. You can see how this network, how tightly it fits together, and it all goes right to Ronald Reagan's lap. This is the West Coast contingent. This is the opposite pole of the Carter. If Carter is a trilateralist with Chase Manhattan, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Eastern Seaboard of the Harvard, Yale, Princeton think tanks, if he is their puppet, how the Ronald Reagan presidency is the direct control of the czarists up at Stanford, and I'll do more on that soon. The Stanford Tower, the Nazis, the assassination teams, the saboteurs, the reckless, senseless killers that have really had control of these assassination, the legwork for the assassinations. The East has helped design the plans, but the West does the legwork. And when Howard Hughes was drugged and doped, it again was done in California, and the empire taken over. These are important personalities and names, and if you're not familiar with them, I have to update you once in a while when their names are in the news. When Stephen Reinhardt wants to be a U.S. federal judge on the Federal Appellate Court, as I said before, his attorney is Mr. Henry Rothblatt, who works with the Eastern Division of the intelligence community in the CIA, connecting from New York to Florida to Dallas, New Orleans, and that group. It's a pretty tight, small group, and if you know the names, it isn't hard to follow in the news and put more pieces of these puzzles together. The history of our times is fascinating. It's one of collusion, conspiracy, blood spilling, murder. It's also a time where we could change the course of history by exposing these people and making the record straight so that someday their names are synonymous with Goering and Himmler and Bormann and Eichmann. They should become household words, and if you know them now, you can follow them better in the news. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week. Maybe you get into some of the ab scam stories.
Wonderful to see people enjoying themselves.